The sun hung merciless in the bleached sky above Dry Creek, its rays beating down on the parched earth like hammer blows on an anvil. Eli Rollins squinted against the glare as his horse picked its way along the dusty trail that served as the town's main approach. The animal's hooves kicked up small clouds of red dust that settled on everything: his worn leather chaps, the faded blue of his shirt, the week's worth of stubble on his jaw. He'd been riding since dawn from his ranch 40 miles north, and all for a few sacks of barley. The drought had hit hard this year, harder than most, and his horses needed feed. Town was the last place he wanted to be, but necessity had a way of making decisions for a man. Dry Creek appeared before him like a collection of weathered bones scattered across the desert floor. False-fronted buildings lined the main street, their painted signs faded and peeling under the relentless sun. A few horses stood tied at hitching posts, their heads low, tails swishing at flies. The smell of dust, horse sweat, and something sour, probably from the saloon, filled his nostrils as he rode down the center of the street. Eli dismounted in front of Morrison's general store. Looping his horse's reins around the post, he paused to pat the animal's neck, feeling the heat radiating from its coat. "Won't be long, boy," he murmured, then stepped up onto the wooden boardwalk. The store's interior offered blessed relief from the sun, though the air inside was thick and stifling. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with everything from canned goods to ammunition, fabric bolts to farming tools. The floorboards creaked under his boots as he made his way to the counter where Chester Morrison, the proprietor, stood talking with two other men. "Told her last week I couldn't extend no more credit," Morrison was saying, his voice carrying that particular tone of self-righteousness that set Eli's teeth on edge. "Woman's got to learn to manage better, is all." One of the men, whom Eli recognized as Tom Garrett from the Double K Ranch, spat tobacco juice into a brass spittoon. "Miriam Harper's always been trouble, even before her husband died." "Died?" the third man snorted. "That's a kind way of putting it." Eli cleared his throat. "Afternoon. Need 3 sacks of barley, if you've got them." Morrison looked up, his merchant smile sliding into place. "Eli Rollins. Haven't seen you in town for months. 3 sacks? That'll be $12. As Eli counted out the money, the bell above the door chimed. The men fell silent as a woman entered, and the very air seemed to shift, growing heavier with unspoken judgment. She was younger than Eli had expected, given the harsh way the men had spoken of her. Maybe 25, with dark hair pulled back in a simple bun and wearing a faded calico dress that had seen better days. But it was her bearing that caught his attention, spine straight, chin lifted, moving with a quiet dignity that seemed to dare the world to break her. "Mr. Morrison," she said, her voice soft but steady. "I need flour, salt, and a tin of lard. Please." Morrison's face hardened. "Cash up front, Mrs. Harper. Like I told you before, I understand." She reached into a small purse and laid coins on the counter. Eli could see from where he stood that it wasn't enough, not nearly enough for what she'd asked for. Morrison counted the coins slowly, deliberately, making a show of it. "This won't cover but half the flour and maybe the salt. No lard." Color rose in her cheeks, but her voice remained steady. "Then I'll take what it will cover. Maybe you should consider other ways of earning money," Tom Garrett said, his meaning clear in his tone. "Widow woman's got to make her way somehow." The woman, Miriam Harper, turned to face him, and Eli saw fire flash in her eyes despite the paleness of her face. "I manage honestly, Mr. Garrett, which is more than some can say. Honest women don't poison their husbands," the third man muttered, loud enough to be heard. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Eli saw Miriam's hands tremble slightly as she turned back to the counter, but her voice didn't waver. "My flour and salt, please, Mr. Morrison." "Actually," Morrison said, and there was cruelty in his smile now. "Looking at these coins again, I don't think they'll cover even that. Prices have gone up, you understand. This might buy you a cup of flour. If that." Eli had seen enough. He stepped forward, placing $2 on the counter beside her coins. "Add what the lady needs to my order." The store went silent. Miriam turned to look at him, and he saw pride warring with desperation in her dark eyes. Up close, he noticed the careful mending in her dress, the worn places on her boots, the way hunger had carved hollows beneath her cheekbones. "I can't accept," she began. "Not accepting anything," Eli said quietly, keeping his eyes on Morrison. "Store made an error in my favor last time I was here. This squares us up. Isn't that right, Morrison?" The storekeeper's face flushed, but faced with Eli's steady gaze, and perhaps remembering that Eli Rollins had a reputation for being good with his fists as well as his guns, he nodded reluctantly. "If you say so, I do." Eli turned to Miriam. "Ma'am, you go ahead and tell him what else you need." For a moment, she stood frozen, searching his face for the catch, the expectation, the price that would come due later. He'd seen that look before, on wounded animals, creatures that had learned not to trust kindness because it so often came with teeth. "Flour, salt, and lard," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. And a small bag of sugar. If it's not too much, my daughter, she—" "Whatever you need," Eli said, then turned away to give her the dignity of not being watched while she completed her purchases. He heard Morrison grudgingly filling her order, heard the rustle of paper as items were wrapped. The other men had fallen silent, but Eli could feel their stares boring into his back. He'd marked himself now, aligned himself with the town pariah. So be it. He'd never had much use for the good opinion of men who took pleasure in kicking people who were already down. When Miriam's purchases were complete, she paused beside him. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I'll find a way to repay you." "No need," he said, touching the brim of his hat. She studied him for another moment, as if trying to solve a puzzle, then gathered her packages and left. Through the window, Eli watched her walk down the street, head high despite the weight of the packages and the heavier weight of the town's judgment. "You've made a mistake, Rollins," Morrison said once she was gone. "That woman's nothing but trouble." "Seems to me," Eli said slowly, "that a woman trying to feed her child in a town full of men who'd rather see her starve isn't the one making trouble." He paid for his barley and arranged to pick it up within the hour, then stepped back out into the blazing sun. Down the street, he could see Miriam Harper's slight figure growing smaller in the distance, walking toward the poor section of town where the respectable folks didn't venture. Eli stood there for a moment, wondering what had possessed him to get involved. He'd come to town for barley. Nothing more. He had no business concerning himself with local troubles, with women who might or might not have poisoned their husbands, with children who needed sugar. But as he watched her disappear around a corner, he found himself thinking about the way she'd held her head high, the flash of fire in her eyes when Garrett had insulted her, the careful dignity with which she'd named her meager purchases. Whatever else Miriam Harper might be, she wasn't what these men said she was. He'd bet his life on it, and given what he'd just done, he realized with a wry smile, he might have to. The afternoon wore on. Eli tended to his horse, checked his saddle, killed time at the blacksmith's shop getting a loose shoe fixed. But his mind kept returning to that moment in the store, to dark eyes that had seen too much and asked for nothing. When he finally loaded his barley and headed out of town, the sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon. Instead of taking the direct route back to his ranch, he found himself turning his horse toward the cluster of rundown properties on the eastern edge of town. He told himself he was just curious. Told himself it didn't matter one way or the other where Miriam Harper lived or how she managed. But when he saw the dilapidated farmhouse sitting alone on a patch of dusty ground, with its sagging porch and patched roof, he knew he'd been lying to himself. A small figure played in the dirt yard, a girl of maybe 6 years, with her mother's dark hair and serious eyes. She looked up as he approached, neither smiling nor running away, just watching with that same careful wariness he'd seen in Miriam. Eli touched his hat to the child and rode on, but the image stayed with him, that lonely house, that silent child, that woman who faced down a hostile town with nothing but pride and determination. He'd come to Dry Creek for barley, but as he rode home through the gathering dusk, Eli Rollins had the unsettling feeling that he'd found something else entirely, something that would change the careful, solitary life he'd built for himself, something that might be worth the trouble it would surely bring. 3 days passed before Eli found himself back on the road to Dry Creek. He'd told himself he needed to check on a horse he'd seen at the livery, maybe pick up some tobacco. But when he found himself loading a small sack of seed corn and another of beans into his saddlebags, he stopped pretending. The Harper place looked worse in the harsh light of midday. The fence posts leaned at drunken angles, held together by wire and determination. What had once been a vegetable garden was now just a patch of cracked earth with a few withered stalks poking through. The house itself seemed to sag under the weight of neglect. Boards weathered to gray, gaps showing between the planks where the chinking had fallen out. Eli dismounted at the gate, uncertain of his welcome. The little girl was nowhere in sight, but he could hear movement inside the house. He tied his horse to what remained of the fence and approached the porch, his boots stirring small clouds of dust with each step. Before he could knock, the door opened. Miriam Harper stood there, a kitchen knife in one hand, her face wary. When she recognized him, confusion replaced suspicion. "Mr. Rollins," he supplied. "Eli Rollins. Mr. Rollins." She didn't lower the knife. "What brings you here?" He gestured toward his horse. "Had some extra seed. Thought maybe—" He trailed off, suddenly aware of how this might look. A man didn't just show up at a widow's house without folks talking. Thought maybe the poor widow could use charity. Her voice held an edge sharp as the blade in her hand. Thought maybe someone trying to keep a garden alive in this drought could use seed that's going to waste in my barn, he corrected quietly. They stood there, measuring each other. Up close, without the town watching, he could see the exhaustion she carried like a weight on her shoulders. Her dress, the same one from 3 days ago, showed signs of recent mending, but her hair was neatly pinned, her apron clean, dignity maintained despite everything. Finally, she stepped back. "I suppose you'd better come in." The interior of the house was spare but clean. A table with 3 mismatched chairs, a wood stove that had seen better days, shelves holding a few dishes and the supplies he'd helped her purchase. Everything spoke of poverty held at bay by fierce pride. "Sarah," Miriam called, and the little girl appeared from what must have been a bedroom. "We have a visitor." The child studied him solemnly, then offered a small curtsy that nearly broke his heart. Where had she learned such manners? And why did she feel the need to use them on a dusty cowboy? "Would you like some water?" Miriam asked, and he heard what it cost her to make even that simple offer. "I'm fine, ma'am. Just wanted to drop off the seed and share some advice about planting in this soil, if you're interested." She set the knife on the table, and he saw her hands were trembling slightly. "Why?" The question hung between them. Why was he here? Why did he care? Why risk his reputation for someone the whole town had condemned? "My mother used to say that good seed should never go to waste," he said finally. "And it seems to me you're trying to grow something here, despite what everyone thinks." Her laugh was bitter. "What everyone thinks? You mean what everyone knows? That I'm a murderess who got away with it? Are you?" The blunt question surprised her. She sank into a chair, suddenly looking younger and more vulnerable. "Would it matter if I said I wasn't?" "Might." She was quiet for a long moment, then began to speak, her voice low and steady. "Ben Harper was a hard man. He had charm when he wanted something, meanness when he didn't get it. We married when I was 17, and I thought—" She shook her head. "It doesn't matter what I thought. After Sarah was born, the drinking got worse. The anger got worse. That last night, he came home in a rage, said he'd lost money gambling, blamed me for it somehow. He raised his hand to Sarah." She stopped, her fingers tracing patterns on the worn wood of the table. "I got between them, Told him he could do what he wanted to me, but not to her. He laughed and said he'd teach us both a lesson. Then he left, said he was going to get his gun, that he'd settle things once and for all. Eli waited, watching her face. He never came back. They found him 3 days later at the bottom of Crater Gorge. Horse came home without him. The sheriff said he'd been drinking, probably rode too close to the edge in the dark. But his brother claimed I must have done something. Poisoned him, maybe. Made him crazy. There was a trial, but they couldn't prove anything because there was nothing to prove. Didn't matter. The verdict in court isn't the one that counts in a town like this. She looked up at him then, meeting his eyes directly. So no, Mr. Rollins, I didn't kill my husband, but I didn't mourn him either. Does that make me guilty? Makes you honest, Eli said. Sarah had crept closer during her mother's story. Now stood pressed against Miriam's side. The protective arm that went around the child was automatic, instinctive. The seed, Eli said, breaking the heavy silence. It's good for this soil. Plant it deep, water at dawn or dusk to avoid the worst evaporation. I can show you some tricks for conserving moisture. And so he did. For the next 2 hours, Eli worked alongside Miriam in the ruined garden, showing her how to build small berms to channel water, how to recognize which soil still had life in it. Sarah followed them, silent as a shadow, carrying the seeds in her apron with the seriousness of a much older child. The sun was brutal, and Eli noticed how Miriam swayed occasionally, how she had to stop to catch her breath. When was the last time she'd eaten a proper meal? But she didn't complain, didn't stop, just kept working with a determination that both impressed and worried him. When they'd planted half the garden, he called a halt. That's enough for today. Seeds need time to settle before the next step. She straightened, wiping her forehead with the back of her hand, leaving a streak of dirt. I don't know how to thank you. No thanks needed, just doing what any neighbor would do. No, she said firmly. That's not true. No one here would do this. Why are you? He didn't have an answer that made sense, even to himself. Instead, he gathered his tools and headed for his horse. I'll come back in a few days. Check on the progress. Make sure you water these tonight, after the sun starts down. He was mounting up when Sarah suddenly ran forward. Mr. Cowboy, she called, then stopped, uncertain. He looked down at her small, serious face. Yes, miss. Are you a good man or a bad man? Sarah! Miriam hurried forward, mortified. But Eli just studied the child thoughtfully. I try to be good. He said, don't always succeed. Why do you ask? Mama says good men don't hurt little girls, but the men in town say bad things to Mama, and they're supposed to be good men. The simple logic of it, the pure confusion in her voice, hit him like a fist. He dismounted and knelt down to her level. Sometimes, people get mixed up about what's good and what's bad. They listen to stories instead of looking at what's true. Your mama's a good woman. Don't let anyone tell you different. Sarah nodded solemnly, then surprised him by throwing her small arms around his neck in a quick hug before running back to her mother. Eli stood, touched his hat to Miriam, and rode away. But the feeling of those thin little arms stayed with him, along with the image of mother and child standing together against the world. That night, a storm rolled in from the mountains. Lightning split the sky, and rain fell in torrents, the kind of violent downpour that did more harm than good. Eli stood on his porch, watching the display, and found himself thinking about that patched roof, those gaps in the walls. He tried to sleep, but the sound of the storm kept pulling him back to consciousness. Were they dry? Was the roof holding? It wasn't his business, wasn't his problem. He'd already done more than he should. But when a particularly vicious crack of thunder shook the house, he gave up pretending. He dressed quickly, saddled his horse despite the rain, and rode out into the storm. It was foolishness, he knew. But the image of Sarah's solemn face, of Miriam's trembling hands as she tried to maintain dignity in the face of the town's contempt, wouldn't let him rest. The ride to their place was treacherous. The road turned to mud. Visibility near zero. But his horse was sure-footed and trusted him, and eventually the dark shape of the house appeared through the rain. He heard Sarah crying before he reached the door. The sound cut through the storm like a knife, high and terrified. Eli didn't bother knocking, just pushed open the door that hung askew on its hinges. Water poured through multiple holes in the roof. Miriam was trying to position pots and buckets to catch the worst of it, but she was fighting a losing battle. Half the main room was already soaked, and in the corner, part of the roof had given way entirely. Sarah huddled on a chair, clutching a ragged doll. Sobbing. "Let me help," Eli said, having to raise his voice over the storm. Miriam whirled around, and for a moment he saw naked relief on her face before she masked it. "The roof's going. I can't stop it." "Get what you need to save. Clothes, food, whatever's important. We're getting out of here." "Where?" "Barn first, then we'll figure out the rest." She didn't argue further, just grabbed a bundle of clothes and the few provisions that weren't already soaked. Eli scooped up Sarah, who wrapped her arms around his neck and buried her face in his shoulder, still crying, the trust in that gesture, from a child who had little reason to trust any man, nearly undid him. They made it to the barn just as another section of the house roof collapsed with a crash. The barn wasn't much, but it was drier than the house. Eli set Sarah down and immediately began checking the structure, moving some old hay bales to create a windbreak, finding relatively dry spots for them to wait out the storm. He built a small fire in an old metal bucket, careful to ventilate it properly. The warmth was meager, but welcome. Miriam had gone silent, sitting with Sarah in her lap, both of them shivering. Eli shrugged off his coat. It was damp but warm from his body heat, and draped it around them. "I can't take," Miriam began. "You can and you will," he said firmly. "That child's cold." They sat in silence while the storm raged outside. Sarah eventually stopped crying, lulled by exhaustion and the relative safety of the barn. Eli kept the fire going, kept watch. This was improper, scandalous by town standards. A man and a widow alone in a barn at night, but propriety seemed a small concern compared to pneumonia or a roof falling on a child's head. "It's gone, isn't it?" Miriam said quietly. "The house. Roof is. Rest might be salvageable." She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "With what? I spent my last coins on food. There's nothing left. We'll figure something out." "We?" She looked at him across the fire. "There's no we, Mr. Rollins. You've been kind, kinder than anyone has a right to expect. But this isn't your problem." "Maybe not," he agreed. "But I'm making it mine anyway." "Why?" The word came out almost as a wail. "Why do you care what happens to us?" He was quiet for a long moment, listening to the storm, watching the firelight play across their faces. Why did he care? Because of a child who asked if he was good or bad? Because of a woman who held her head high when the world tried to break her? Because he'd been alone too long and had forgotten what it felt like to have someone need him? "My brother died 5 years ago," he said finally, "ambushed by rustlers. I was supposed to be with him that day, but I'd gone to town instead, drinking, gambling, being a fool." He paused, the memory still sharp. "By the time I got back, it was too late. Found him shot, dying slow. Held him while he went." Miriam said nothing, just watched him. "Told myself I'd never stand by again while people needed help. Never take the easy road when the hard one was right. Your girl asked if I was good or bad. Truth is, I'm trying to balance the scales. Don't know if it's possible. But I keep trying." The fire popped, sending sparks up. Sarah stirred but didn't wake. "I don't want to be anyone's penance," Miriam said softly. "You're not. You're just someone who needs help, and I'm someone who can give it." They sat in silence after that, waiting for dawn, waiting for the storm to pass. When pale light finally filtered through the barn's gaps, Eli stepped outside to assess the damage. The house was a disaster. Half the roof gone, water damage throughout, but the walls still stood, and walls could be rebuilt. He made his decision then, standing in the muddy yard with the sunrise painting the wet world gold. He'd help them, not out of guilt or duty, but because somewhere between that moment in the store and this morning after the storm, Miriam Harper and her daughter had become important to him. It would cause talk. It would damage his reputation. It might cost him business and friendships. But as he watched Miriam emerge from the barn, Sarah's hand in hers, both of them wearing his coat like a tent, he found he didn't care about any of that. He'd come to town for barley. He'd found something worth infinitely more. The morning after the storm dawned clear and merciless, as if the sky had exhausted all its sympathy in the night's deluge. Eli stood in the wreckage of what had been the Harper home, calculating what could be saved and what would need to be rebuilt from scratch. The damage was worse in full daylight. Half the roof gone, water stains spreading like bruises across the walls, floorboards warped and splitting. "I can help for a few hours," he told Miriam, who stood in the doorway clutching a bucket, as if she could bail out disaster one pail at a time. "Then I need to get back to my ranch, gather proper tools and materials." She nodded, her face carefully neutral. He'd learned already that she wore that expression like armor, protecting herself from both kindness and cruelty with equal determination. They worked in relative silence, salvaging what they could. Sarah helped by carrying smaller items outside to dry in the sun, clothes, blankets, the few books they owned. Eli noticed how carefully the child handled each water-damaged item, as if she understood that these meager possessions were all that stood between them and complete destitution. By noon, the heat had become oppressive. Eli had removed the worst of the damaged roofing, covering the exposed sections with an old tarp he'd found in the barn. It wouldn't hold against another storm, but it might keep the dew off for a night or two. He was securing the last corner when he heard horses approaching. 3 riders appeared on the road, and Eli recognized them immediately. Sheriff Watson, a thin man who wore his authority like an ill-fitting coat, flanked by Tom Garrett and another rancher named Pike Stevens. "Rollins," the sheriff called out as they drew near. "Heard you were out here." Eli climbed down from the roof, noting how the men positioned themselves, not quite surrounding him, but making their numbers clear. "Sheriff, boys, what brings you out this way?" Watson shifted in his saddle, his eyes sliding past Eli to where Miriam stood. "Got some concerns from the good folks in town about the propriety of this situation." "What situation would that be?" Eli kept his voice mild, but his hand rested casual-like near his hip, close to the hammer he'd been using, but also close to the Colt on his belt. "Unmarried man spending time at the widow Harper's place," Garrett said, not bothering with the sheriff's diplomatic approach. "Folks are talking. Folks are always talking," Eli replied. "Seems to me they might find better uses for their tongues, like asking why a woman and child were left to face that storm in a house not fit for animals." Pike Stevens, a heavy-set man with mean eyes, spat tobacco juice near Eli's boots. "Maybe because decent people don't associate with murderesses." Eli felt rather than saw Miriam stiffen behind him. Before he could respond, Sarah appeared around the corner of the house, dragging a waterlogged mattress that was twice her size. She stopped when she saw the men, her small face going carefully blank. "Afternoon, Sheriff Watson," she said with that too-adult courtesy that made Eli's chest tight. "Mr. Garrett, Mr. Stevens." The sight of the child, thin, working like a grown person, addressing them with more manners than they'd shown her mother, seemed to momentarily shame even these hard men. Watson cleared his throat. "You helping your mama, little one?" "Yes, sir. The storm knocked our house down. But Eli is helping us fix it." She looked at Eli with such trust it nearly broke him. "He's teaching me about building. Says I'm a good helper." That's good," Watson said, clearly uncomfortable. Garrett wasn't so easily deterred. "Still doesn't look right. Rollins, you want to play carpenter? Fine. But you shouldn't be here alone with her. Give the woman ideas." "What ideas would those be?" Eli asked, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet. That someone in this town has a shred of Christian charity? That maybe folks who call themselves good might actually do good instead of just flapping their gums about it? Watch your tone, Stevens growled. Or what? Eli stepped forward. You'll run me out of town? Try it. You'll talk bad about me? Already started, I'm sure. You'll make business difficult for me? Most of my dealings are outside Dry Creek anyway. He looked each man in the eye. I'm fixing a roof for a woman and child who need shelter. If you've got a problem with that, then maybe you should examine your own consciences instead of riding out here to examine mine. The tension stretched tight as fence wire. Watson, ever the politician, tried to diffuse it. Now, no need for anyone to get heated. We're just concerned about appearances, is all. Maybe if someone else was here too. A woman from town. Which woman? Miriam spoke for the first time, stepping out from behind Eli. Which of the good ladies of Dry Creek would lower herself to help me? Mrs. Morrison, who crosses the street when she sees me coming. Mrs. Garrett, who tells her children I'm a witch. Or perhaps Mrs. Stevens, who suggested at the general store that I should consider selling myself since I'd already sold my soul. The men had the grace to look uncomfortable at that. Even hard men sometimes flinched when faced with the consequences of their women's cruelty. Ma'am, Watson started, but Miriam wasn't finished. Mr. Rollins is the only person in this town who's shown us a moment's kindness. If you want to make something ugly out of that, then the ugliness is in your minds, not in his actions. She lifted her chin, every inch the lady despite her patched dress and work-roughened hands. Now, if you'll excuse us, we have work to do, unless you've come to help. The silence that followed was answer enough. Watson turned his horse. Just be mindful of appearances. Rollins, for everyone's sake. After they left, Eli found Miriam trembling, her brave facade crumbling. They'll make trouble for you now, she said. I shouldn't have spoken like that. You spoke the truth, Eli said. Nothing wrong with that. She laughed bitterly. The truth doesn't fix roofs or buy food or protect little girls from cruel words. No, he agreed. But it's a start. They returned to work, but the visit had cast a shadow over the day. Eli could see Miriam pulling back into herself, could see her wrestling with the cost of accepting his help. When he finally prepared to leave for his ranch, she stopped him at the gate. Don't come back, she said quietly. Please, you've done more than enough, and I won't have you ruined for our sake. He studied her face, saw the resignation there, the weary acceptance of someone who'd learned not to hope. I'll be back tomorrow with lumber and proper tools. We'll need to start early if we want to get the roof frame up before the heat gets too bad. Didn't you hear me? I said, I heard you. I'm choosing not to listen. He mounted his horse. You can be as proud as you want, Miriam Harper, but that pride won't keep the rain off Sarah's head. I'll be here at dawn. He rode away before she could argue further, but he caught a glimpse of her face as he left. Surprise, frustration, and something else that might have been the first fragile shoot of hope. The next morning, true to his word, Eli arrived at dawn with a wagon loaded with lumber, nails, and tools. He'd spent good money on the materials, more than he should have. But the memory of Sarah dragging that sodden mattress had loosened his purse strings. Miriam was already up, had coffee, thin and bitter but hot, waiting for him. I still think this is a mistake, she said by way of greeting. Noted, he replied, accepting the cup gratefully. Where's Sarah? Sleeping. She had bad dreams all night, kept thinking the rest of the roof would fall. They set to work as the sun climbed. Eli showed Miriam how to measure and cut, how to hold a board steady while he nailed, how to check if something was level. She was a quick learner, her hands steady despite their city-bred softness. By the time Sarah woke and joined them, they'd made significant progress on the frame. The child appointed herself water-bearer, bringing them cups throughout the morning, watching everything with those two serious eyes. When Eli let her hammer in a few nails under his careful supervision, her face lit up with the first real smile he'd seen from her. "I'm building," she announced proudly. "I'm helping build our house." "You surely are." Eli agreed, ruffling her hair. "Best assistant I've had in years." They worked through the heat of the day, and by evening had most of the new roof frame in place. Tomorrow they'd start on the shingles, but for now, it was enough. Eli's back ached. His hands were raw despite his calluses, and he'd sweated through his shirt twice over. But seeing the structure taking shape, seeing Miriam's careful hope and Sarah's excitement made every ache worthwhile. As the sun set, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson, Miriam called them for supper. It was simple fare, beans seasoned with wild herbs, cornbread, and preserves that she'd somehow saved from the storm. But sitting at that rickety table, with Sarah chattering about her day's adventures in building and Miriam allowing herself small smiles, it felt like a feast. "Mr. Eli," Sarah said suddenly, "are you going to live here now?" The innocent question fell like a stone into still water. Miriam went very still, her eyes fixed on her plate. "No, sweetheart," Eli said gently. "I have my own ranch, but I'll be around until your house is fixed proper." "Oh," Sarah considered this. "But after it's fixed, will you still visit?" "Sarah," Miriam said quietly, "Mr. Rollins has his own life. We can't expect—" "I reckon I might stop by from time to time." Eli interrupted. "Check on my handiwork. Make sure you're taking care of the garden we planted." Sarah beamed, but Miriam's expression was unreadable after the child had been put to bed. Miriam walked Eli to his wagon. "You shouldn't make promises you can't keep," she said. "I don't." She wrapped her arms around herself, though the evening was warm. "This is temporary. It has to be. You're a good man, Eli Rollins, with a life and a reputation. I won't let you throw that away for us. Seems to me," he said slowly, "that a man ought to get to decide for himself what's worth keeping and what's worth risking." She looked up at him then, starlight catching in her eyes. "And what have you decided?" The question hung between them, loaded with more weight than words should carry. Eli found himself studying her face, the determined set of her jaw, the vulnerability she tried so hard to hide, the strength that adversity had forged in her like steel in a fire. "I've decided," he said finally, "that some things matter more than what people think, that maybe I've been living safe for too long, that a woman who faces down sheriffs and storms alike, and a little girl who asks the hard questions might be worth any amount of trouble." Miriam's breath caught, and for a moment he thought she might cry. Instead, she straightened her spine and nodded. "Then I'll see you tomorrow, Mr. Rollins." "Eli," he corrected. "Just Eli." "Eli," she repeated, and his name on her lips sounded like a promise. He drove home through the darkness, whistling a tune he hadn't thought of in years. Behind him, in a house with half a roof and too many troubles, a woman stood watching until his wagon disappeared into the night. And in her eyes, hope, fragile and dangerous and absolutely unstoppable, began to bloom. The whispers started as ripples and grew to waves. Within 2 weeks of Eli beginning work on the Harper house, the good citizens of Dry Creek had worked themselves into a righteous fervor. He noticed it in the way conversation stopped when he entered Morrison's store, in the cold shoulders at the blacksmith's, in the sudden unavailability of day laborers he'd planned to hire for his own ranch. But it was Saturday afternoon when matters came to a head. Eli had spent the morning in town gathering supplies, enduring the stares and whispers with growing irritation. The roof was nearly complete now, and he had been planning to start on repairing the damaged walls. Miriam had insisted on paying him back somehow, so she'd been taking in mending work, her fine stitching earning grudging approval even from those who despised her. He was loading lumber when they came, 5 men liquored up despite the early hour, led by Tom Garrett with Pike Stevens close behind. They moved with the purposeful swagger of men who'd been building their courage in a bottle and their righteousness in an echo chamber of similar minds. "Rollins," Garrett called out, his voice carrying across the street. "We need words with you." Eli continued loading, not turning around. "Speak your piece then," Look at a man when he's talking to you." Stevens slurred. Eli set down the plank he was holding and turned slowly. Other townspeople had stopped to watch, creating an impromptu audience. He recognized Jake Fuller from the Double K Ranch, Will Bronson, who ran cattle east of town, and Charlie Mack, who worked at the livery. Not bad men individually, but whiskey and mob mentality had a way of changing that. "I'm looking," Eli said evenly. "What I see doesn't impress me much." Garrett's face flushed. "You've been warned about that Harper woman. Sheriff Watson told you to mind appearances. I've been fixing a roof, nothing more." "Liar," Stevens spat. "May Henderson saw you eating supper there, playing house with that Jezebel and her brat." The word Jezebel made Eli's hands curl into fists, but he kept his voice level. "Mrs. Harper offered me a meal after a day's work. That's called hospitality where I come from." "We know what it's called." Charlie Mack laughed ugly. "Same thing her husband got. Probably. Watch she doesn't poison your food. Rollins. Or maybe that's what you're counting on," Garrett suggested with a nasty smile. "Maybe you figure on having the widow all to yourself. Proper-like. Course. You'd have to survive the wedding night first." The implications hung in the air like smoke from a cheap cigar. Eli felt the familiar cold settling into his bones. The same feeling he'd had before gunfights in his younger days. But this wasn't that kind of problem. Not yet. "You boys are drunk," he said quietly. "Go sleep it off before you say something you'll regret." "Regret?" Fuller stepped forward, emboldened. "Only thing we regret is having trash like her in our town. And now you're sniffing around her like a dog after—" The punch came fast. Eli's fist connecting with Fuller's jaw before the man could finish the vulgar comparison. Fuller went down hard, and suddenly everyone was moving. Stevens swung wild, catching Eli's shoulder. Bronson tried to grab him from behind. The street erupted in dust and shouting. Eli had been in plenty of fights, knew how to use his weight and reach. He put Bronson down with an elbow to the gut, dodged Mac's clumsy rush, but 5-on-1 were bad odds, even for him. A bottle caught him above the eye, opening a cut that bled freely. Someone's boot found his ribs when he stumbled. Then, unexpectedly, the odds shifted. John Hartley, the banker's son, stepped in, pulling Mac off Eli's back. "That's enough. 5 against 1 ain't sporting. Stay out of this, boy," Garrett warned. But other voices were joining in, some calling for the fight to stop, others egging it on. The street had become a melee of conflicting loyalties and alcohol-fueled passion. Eli managed to get to his feet, blood running down his face, ribs protesting. Stevens was coming at him again when a shotgun blast split the air. Everyone froze. Sheriff Watson stood on the boardwalk, smoking shotgun pointed skyward. "That's enough. All of you, break it up now." The crowd began to disperse, men helping their fallen friends, muttering threats and promises. Garrett, sporting a split lip, pointed at Eli. "This ain't over. Rollins, you've chosen your side. Remember that." As the troublemakers slouched away, Watson approached Eli. "You all right?" "I'll live." Eli touched the cut above his eye, wincing. "You're making things hard on yourself," the sheriff said quietly. "And on her, this kind of trouble follows that woman like a shadow." "Maybe," Eli said. "The trouble's not following her. Maybe it's being thrown at her by folks who ought to know better." Watson sighed. "Maybe so, but right and wrong don't always matter as much as they should. You'd best get that cut seen to." Eli gathered his scattered supplies, loaded his wagon under the watchful eyes of those who remained. His ribs hurt with each movement, and the cut wouldn't stop bleeding. But what bothered him most was knowing this would get back to Miriam, knowing she'd blame herself. He drove out of town, but instead of heading to his ranch, he found himself turning toward the Harper place. He needed to warn her, needed to make sure she and Sarah were safe. The men who jumped him were cowards, but cowards in groups could be dangerous. The sun was setting when he arrived, painting the newly repaired roof in shades of copper. Miriam was in the garden, tending the plants that had begun to sprout from the seeds he'd brought. She looked up at his approach, and her face went white when she saw the blood. Dear God, what happened? It's nothing, he said, climbing down from the wagon with a grunt of pain. Just a disagreement in town. But she was already moving, taking his arm, guiding him to sit on the porch steps. Sarah, she called. Bring water and the clean rags from the kitchen. I'm fine, Eli protested, but she was having none of it. Hush. Her fingers were gentle as she examined the cut. This needs stitching. Sarah, honey, get my sewing box too. You don't need to. I said hush. There was steel in her voice now. Was it because of me? Because you've been helping us? He didn't answer, which was answer enough. Her hands stilled for a moment, then resumed their work. Sarah brought the supplies, her eyes wide at the sight of blood. Is Mr. Eli going to die? She whispered. No, sweetheart, Miriam said firmly. Mr. Eli is going to be fine, but I need you to be very brave and help me. Can you do that? The child nodded solemnly, while Miriam cleaned the wound. Sarah held the basin, her small hands steady despite her fear. The tenderness of it, this woman and child caring for him with such matter-of-fact competence, made his throat tight. This will hurt, Miriam warned, threading a needle. I've had worse. She worked quickly, her stitches neat and precise. Eli focused on her face to distract from the pain, the concentration in her eyes, the way she bit her lower lip, the strand of hair that had escaped her bun and curved along her cheek. When she finished, she sat back, blood on her hands and apron. There, that should hold. Then, softer. I'm so sorry. For what? You didn't throw any punches? No, but you took them because of me. Because you dared to show kindness to the town pariah. She stood abruptly, wrapping her arms around herself. This is what I was afraid of. You should go. Eli, go and don't come back. For your own good. He stood too, ignoring the protest from his ribs. We've had this conversation before, and now you've been beaten in the street because of it. She whirled to face him, and he saw tears in her eyes. Don't you understand? This will only get worse. They'll turn on you completely, destroy your business, your reputation, maybe worse. And for what? For a woman who can give you nothing but trouble? Miriam? No! The word came out broken. I won't have it. I won't have you hurt because of me. God knows I've caused enough pain in this world. You haven't caused anything, Eli said firmly. Small-minded people and their poison caused this. Fear and gossip and too much whiskey caused this. Not you. She laughed bitterly. The reason doesn't matter when you're bleeding. Sarah had been watching this exchange with growing distress. Now she tugged on Eli's pants leg. You're not going away forever, are you? You promised you'd visit. Eli knelt down to her level, wincing. I keep my promises, little one. Even if people are mean to you? Especially then. Sarah threw her arms around his neck, careful of his injuries. Good, because Mama smiles when you're here, and she doesn't smile much other times. Sarah, Miriam's face flushed, but Eli was looking at her over Sarah's shoulder, seeing the truth of the child's words in Miriam's embarrassed expression. Is that so? He asked softly. Miriam turned away, busying herself with gathering the medical supplies. Children say all sorts of things. Children tell the truth more often than adults. Eli countered. He set Sarah down gently. Why don't you go wash up for supper, sweetheart? Your mama and I need to talk. After Sarah went inside, Eli approached Miriam where she stood at the porch railing, looking out at the darkening desert. Those men today, he said quietly. They think they know you, think they have you all figured out. But they don't see what I see. And what do you see? Her voice was barely a whisper. I see a woman who's been knocked down but keeps getting up, who faces each day with courage even when the whole world's against her, who's raising a little girl to be kind and brave despite everything. He paused, choosing his words carefully. I see someone worth fighting for. She turned to him then, and in the dying light, he could see the battle in her eyes, hope warring with fear, longing with practicality. I'm not worth your life, Eli Rollins. Shouldn't I get to decide that? They stood there, close enough to touch but not touching, the desert evening wrapping around them like a blanket. Somewhere a coyote called, and the first stars began to appear. "Stay for supper," she said finally. "Let me at least feed you before you go home." "Trying to poison me after all?" he asked with a slight smile. She almost smiled back. Maybe just a little. They ate by lamplight, beans and biscuits and the last of the preserved peaches. Sarah chattered about the garden, about a lizard she'd seen, about anything except the violence that had brought Eli here bloodied. But underneath the normal conversation ran a current of change, of decisions approaching like riders on a dark road. When Eli finally prepared to leave, Miriam walked him to his wagon. "They'll come here next," she said quietly. "Those men, when going after you isn't enough, they'll come here." "Then I'll be here too," Eli said simply. "You can't protect us all the time." "Maybe not, but I can try." She reached up suddenly, her fingertips ghosting over the stitches she'd placed. "I wish," she began, then stopped. "What do you wish?" "I wish we'd met in another life. Another place where you could court me proper, without blood and threats. Where Sarah could play without checking over her shoulder. Where we could just be." The wistfulness in her voice nearly undid him. Without thinking, he caught her hand, held it against his cheek. "This is the life we have," he said softly. "But maybe we can still make something good from it." For a moment, she leaned into him, allowing herself that small comfort. Then she pulled away, stepped back. "Good night, Eli. Be careful going home." He drove away into the darkness, his ribs aching, his head throbbing, but his resolve stronger than ever. Behind him, a woman stood watching until the night swallowed him whole, her hand pressed to her heart as if holding something precious and fragile inside. The lines had been drawn in blood and whiskey, but Eli Rollins had chosen his side, and he'd stand by it come hell or high water, because some things, some people, were worth any fight. A month passed after the fight, a month of uneasy quiet that felt like the pause before a thunderstorm. Eli continued his work at the Harper place, though he took to wearing his gun more prominently and watching the road with sharper attention. The house was nearly restored now, walls patched, roof solid, even a new coat of whitewash that made it look almost respectable. He'd kept his distance from town, except for necessary supplies, and even then, he felt the weight of hostile stares and heard the whispered conversations that stopped when he passed. His ranch was suffering from the neglect, and he'd lost 2 contracts for horse sales when buyers suddenly found reasons to take their business elsewhere. But it wasn't his own troubles that brought him to town on that hot September morning. It was Sarah's fever. He'd arrived at the Harper place at dawn to find Miriam beside herself with worry. Sarah had been sick for 2 days, burning hot and delirious, calling out for her papa and for Eli in alternating breaths that broke his heart. "I need to get Doc Winters," Miriam had said, her usual composure shattered. "But he won't come. Not for me. I went yesterday, and he wouldn't even open his door." So here Eli was, standing outside the doctor's office, his jaw set with determination. He knocked hard, kept knocking until the door opened. Doc Winters was a thin man with spectacles and the soft look of someone who'd never missed a meal or faced a hard day's labor. He took one look at Eli and tried to close the door, but Eli's boot was already in the way. "There's a sick child needs tending," Eli said without preamble. "I heard the Harper girl." Winters adjusted his spectacles nervously. "I can't help with that." "Can't or won't? Does it matter? I have my reputation to think of, my other patients." Eli pushed the door open wider, stepped inside despite Winters's protests. "Your other patients? You mean like Tom Garrett's boy when he broke his arm last spring? Or Pike Stevens's wife when she had that difficult birth? Funny how your reputation didn't stop you from helping them. That's different. Only difference I see." Eli interrupted, his voice dropping low and dangerous. "Is that those folks can pay more? That what this is about? Doc? Money?" "No, I mean," The Harper woman is trouble. Everyone knows. Everyone knows gossip and lies. What I know is there's a 6-year-old girl burning up with fever, and you're the only doctor for 50 miles. Eli stepped closer, and Winters backed up until he hit his desk. Now, you can come willing, or I can drag you. But either way, you're coming. Winters swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. You wouldn't dare. Sheriff Watson isn't here, and that child might be dying while we waste time talking. Eli let his hand rest on his gun belt, a subtle reminder. What's it going to be, Doc? For a moment, they stared at each other. Then Winters' shoulders slumped. I'll get my bag. The ride to the Harper place was tense and silent. Eli could feel the doctor's resentment radiating like heat from a stove, but he didn't care. All that mattered was Sarah. Miriam nearly cried with relief when she saw them. She led Winters to the small bedroom where Sarah lay, her small body dwarfed by the fever's violence. The child's face was flushed, her breathing rapid and shallow. Winters, whatever his faults, was a competent doctor when he chose to be. He examined Sarah thoroughly, listened to her chest, felt her pulse. His face grew increasingly grave. It's pneumonia, he said finally. Advanced. The fever's been too long unchecked. Can you help her? Miriam's voice was barely a whisper. I can try, but... He hesitated, glancing at Eli. She needs medicine I don't carry with me. Quinine for the fever, laudanum for the pain, other compounds. They're expensive. I'll pay, Eli said immediately. It's not just the cost. I'd have to order them from Denver. It would take at least a week, maybe 2. She doesn't have 2 weeks, Miriam said, reading the truth in the doctor's face. Winters nodded reluctantly. There might be another way. The Army Fort, Fort Harrison, 2 days' ride north. They have a hospital, medical supplies. They might help if... He trailed off. If what? Eli demanded. If they believe the child is worth saving, they don't generally treat civilians, especially not... He glanced at Miriam. Not everyone. Eli was already moving. Then I'll make them believe it. Doc, write down what she needs. Exact medicines and doses. Miriam, pack light. We're leaving within the hour. We can't just ride to an Army fort and demand, watch me. Eli's voice brooked no argument. Doc, you'll stay here. Keep her stable till we get back. And you'll do your best. Or I'll know why. Winters nodded, perhaps recognizing that arguing with Eli in this mood was pointless. He began writing out the medical requirements while Eli helped Miriam prepare for the journey. Within an hour, they were on the road. Eli had rigged a travois behind his horse, padding it with blankets to make a bed for Sarah. Miriam rode her old mule, staying close to her daughter's side. The child was wrapped in quilts despite the heat, alternating between fever dreams and moments of painful clarity. The journey was hellish. The September sun beat down mercilessly, and they had to stop frequently to give Sarah water and wipe her burning skin with damp cloths. At night, they made camp under the stars, taking turns watching over the child. It was during the second night, as Eli tended the fire while Miriam dozed exhaustedly beside Sarah, that the child woke clearly for the first time in days. Mr. Eli? Her voice was tiny, cracked. He was beside her immediately. I'm here, little one. Are we going on an adventure? Something like that. We're going to get you medicine. Make you all better. She was quiet for a moment. Then, am I dying? Like Papa did? The question hit him like a physical blow. No, sweetheart. You're not dying. Your mama and I won't let that happen. Promise? He took her small, hot hand in his. I promise. She smiled weakly and drifted back to sleep. Eli sat there, holding her hand, and made silent vows to whatever powers might be listening. This child would not die. Not on his watch. They reached Fort Harrison as the sun was setting on the second day. The fort squatted on the landscape like a wooden beast, walls high and forbidding. Soldiers at the gate challenged them, rifles at ready. State your business. Medical emergency. Eli said, Child with pneumonia. We need to see your doctor. The guards exchanged glances. Fort medical facilities are for military personnel only. Then get me someone with authority to make exceptions. Sir, you need to leave. Sergeant, Miriam interrupted, her voice cutting through their protests. My daughter is dying. Please, if you have any mercy in your heart, any at all, please help us. Something in her voice, the raw desperation of a mother watching her child slip away, made the sergeant hesitate. He looked at Sarah's still form on the travois, at Miriam's tear-stained face, at Eli's determined stance. Wait here, he said finally, and disappeared inside. Minutes crawled by like hours. Sarah's breathing grew more labored, each breath a struggle. Miriam held her daughter's hand and prayed silently while Eli paced, ready to fight their way in if necessary. Finally, the gates opened. A man in major's insignia approached, followed by the sergeant and another soldier carrying a medical bag. I'm Major Collins, the officer said, his eyes taking in the scene. Sergeant Mills says you have a sick child. Pneumonia, Eli said. She needs quinine, laudanum. Whatever your doctors have, I can pay. Peace, sir. Collins was already kneeling by the travois, examining Sarah with practiced hands. His face grew grave. Sergeant, have them bring the child to the hospital immediately. Tell Dr. Brennan to prepare for an emergency case. Sir, regulations state. I'm aware of regulations. Sergeant, I'm also aware that I command this fort. Collins stood, his voice carrying the authority of a man used to being obeyed. Move! Soldiers scrambled to comply. Sarah was lifted gently and carried inside. Miriam hurrying alongside. Eli started to follow, but Collins stopped him. You're not the child's father. It wasn't a question. Eli met his gaze steadily. No, but I'm the one who got them here. Collins studied him. And the mother? There's a story there, I think. There's always a story. Right now, all that matters is saving that little girl. On that, we agree. Collins gestured for him to follow. Come, doctor. Brennan is the best physician I've served with. If anyone can save her, he can. The fort's hospital was small but clean, smelling of carbolic and soap. Doctor Brennan, a gruff man with gentle hands, took charge immediately. Miriam was allowed to stay with Sarah, but Eli was directed to a waiting area where he paced for hours, wearing a groove in the floor. Major Collins joined him after a time, offering a cup of coffee that tasted like boiled leather but was welcome nonetheless. The child's mother, Collins said carefully. She's not your wife. No. Yet you rode 2 days through hostile territory for her daughter. Eli was too tired for pretense. Yes. Collins was quiet for a moment. I had a daughter once. Fever took her 5 years ago. She was about that little one's age. He paused. Doctor, Brennan lost his son to pneumonia last winter. He'll fight hard for your girl. She's not. Eli started to correct him, then stopped. Because Sarah was his, wasn't she? In all the ways that mattered. Thank you. Dawn was breaking when Dr. Brennan finally emerged. He looked exhausted but satisfied. The fever broke an hour ago. She's sleeping naturally now. It was close. Closer than I like. But she's a fighter. Eli sagged with relief. Can I see them? Briefly, they both need rest. He found them in a small, clean room. Sarah looked tiny in the military-issue bed, but her color was better, her breathing easier. Miriam sat beside her, holding her hand, tears streaming down her face. When she saw Eli, she rose and came to him, collapsing against his chest. She's going to be all right, she whispered. You saved her. You saved my baby. He held her as she cried, his own eyes burning. Over her shoulder, he could see Sarah sleeping peacefully, and the tight band around his chest finally eased. They stayed at the fort for 3 days while Sarah recovered. Major Collins, perhaps remembering his own lost daughter, bent regulations to allow it. Dr. Brennan provided medicines and detailed instructions for continued care. On the last evening, as Eli helped load their wagon with supplies the fort had generously provided, Collins approached him, that woman and child, he said quietly. They have no one else? They have me. Collins nodded slowly. See that they keep you, then the world's hard enough without facing it alone. The journey home was far different from the desperate flight out. Sarah, though weak, was alert and chattering about her adventure at the soldier fort. Miriam smiled more in those 2 days than Eli had seen in all their time together. When they finally crested the rise above Dry Creek, Miriam reached over and took Eli's hand. I can never repay you for this, she said softly. Don't want repayment. What do you want then? He looked at her, at Sarah singing softly to her doll, at the life they'd fought to preserve. Just this, he said simply. A chance at this. She squeezed his hand and didn't let go until they reached her door. And when the town gossip saw them return together, saw the way they looked at each other, saw Sarah calling out, Mr. Eli, we're home, with joy in her voice. The whispers started again, but Eli found he didn't care anymore. He'd nearly lost them both, and that had clarified everything. Some things were worth fighting for. Some people were worth any scandal. And as he helped them settle back into their home, as Sarah demanded he tell the soldiers stories again, as Miriam smiled at him with her heart in her eyes, Eli knew he'd found what he hadn't even realized he'd been searching for. A family, his family, and he'd defended against all comers. The decision came easier than Eli had expected. After weeks of traveling between his ranch and the Harper place, after seeing how the townspeople's hostility was escalating, after watching Miriam grow thinner with worry despite Sarah's recovery, he knew what had to be done. Pack your things, he told her one October morning, arriving with an empty wagon. You're coming to live at my ranch. Miriam looked up from where she was patching yet another hole in the wall. Someone had thrown rocks at the house again in the night. Eli, we can't. Yes, you can. And you will. He softened his tone. This place isn't safe anymore. Miriam, you know it as well as I do. She set down her tools, her shoulders sagging. Last night had been the worst yet, drunken voices shouting obscenities, the crash of breaking glass, Sarah crying in terror. They'd found dead chickens on the doorstep this morning, their necks wrung, a clear threat. People will talk, she said weakly, but he could see she was already calculating what they could take, what they'd have to leave behind. People are already talking, at least at my place. I can protect you properly. Your reputation is my concern, not yours. He stepped closer. Miriam, I'm not letting pride, yours or mine, put you and Sarah in danger anymore. Now, what needs packing? Sarah, who had been listening from the doorway, ran to him with a cry of joy. We're going to live with you, really? If your mama agrees, Eli said, lifting her up. The child weighed barely anything, still recovering from her illness. Please, Mama, Sarah begged. Please say yes. I don't like it here anymore. The mean men scare me. That broke through Miriam's last resistance. All right, she whispered. All right. They packed through the day. Clothes, dishes, the few pieces of furniture worth taking. Neighbors watched from behind curtains, but no one offered to help. As they loaded the last box, Miriam stood looking at the house she'd fought so hard to keep. Ben and I lived here for 7 years, she said quietly. Sarah was born in that back room. Despite everything, there were some good memories here. You can make new memories, Eli said gently. Better ones. She nodded, squaring her shoulders. Yes, we can. The ride to Eli's ranch took 3 hours. As they crested the final hill and the buildings came into view, Miriam drew in a sharp breath. The ranch was modest but well-maintained. A solid 2-story house with a wraparound porch, a large barn, several outbuildings, and corrals holding fine horses. It's beautiful, she said softly. It's home, Eli corrected. You're home now. The house interior was clearly a bachelor's domain, functional but sparse, lacking the touches that made a place welcoming. But it was clean, solid, and safe. Eli had prepared the 2 spare bedrooms, laying out fresh linens, even putting wildflowers in a jar on Sarah's nightstand. This is my room? Sarah asked in wonder, touching the quilt on the bed. All mine. All yours, little one, Eli confirmed. "And your mama's is right next door." That first evening was awkward. They moved around each other carefully, uncertain of the new boundaries. Miriam insisted on cooking supper, seeming to find comfort in the familiar activity. Sarah explored every corner of the house, exclaiming over discoveries: books on shelves, a chess set, a guitar in the corner. "Do you play?" Miriam asked, noticing Sarah's interest in the instrument. "Used to," Eli admitted. "Haven't in years. Will you play for us sometime?" "Maybe." After Sarah was put to bed, exhausted from the day's excitement, Eli and Miriam sat on the porch. The night was clear, stars brilliant in the desert sky. "I need to be useful," Miriam said abruptly. "I won't be a kept woman. Eli, I need to earn our place here." "You don't need to earn anything. You're here because you're kind, because you're good. I know." She turned to face him. "But I need this for me. Let me help with the ranch work. Let me cook, keep house, whatever's needed. Please." He studied her face in the lamplight, seeing the pride that was as much a part of her as breathing. "All right, ranch could use a woman's touch anyway." She smiled, the tension easing from her shoulders. "Thank you." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds, coyotes in the distance, horses shifting in the corrals, the whisper of wind through cottonwoods. "Eli," she said eventually, "what are we doing?" He knew what she meant. The question that had hung between them for months, unspoken but always present. "I don't rightly know," he admitted. "But I know having you and Sarah here feels right, more right than anything has in a long time." "The townspeople won't accept this. They'll make trouble for you." "Let them try." His voice hardened. "This is my land, my home. I'll defend it and everyone in it." She shivered slightly, though the night was warm. Without thinking, Eli shifted closer, his arm going around her shoulders. She stiffened for a moment, then relaxed against him. "I'm frightened," she admitted quietly. "Not of them, not anymore, but of this, of hoping for something I shouldn't want." "What do you want?" She was quiet so long he thought she wouldn't answer. Then, "I want Sarah to grow up safe. I want to wake up without checking for threats. I want—" She paused, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I want to stop being alone." "You're not alone anymore," he said firmly. "Neither of you." She turned her face up to his then, and he saw everything in her eyes, fear and hope and something deeper, something that made his heart race. The moment stretched between them, fragile as spun glass. "Miriam," he said roughly, "I need you to know something. I didn't bring you here expecting— that is, I don't assume." She placed a finger against his lips, silencing him. "I know. You're an honorable man. Eli Rollins. It's one of the many things I admire about you." The word admire seemed inadequate for the emotion in her voice, but neither was ready for stronger words. Not yet. The next days fell into a pattern. Miriam transformed the house with small touches, curtains at windows, flowers on tables, the smell of baking bread. Sarah followed Eli around the ranch like a shadow, asking endless questions about horses and cattle and ranch life. In the evenings, they ate together like a family. And sometimes Eli would bring out the guitar and play simple songs that made Sarah clap and Miriam smile. It was domestic and peaceful, and everything Eli hadn't known he'd wanted. But underneath ran a current of awareness between him and Miriam, growing stronger each day. It came to a head 2 weeks after they'd moved in. A storm blew in suddenly while Eli was out checking the herd. By the time he made it back, he was soaked through and shivering. Miriam met him at the door with towels and worry. "You'll catch your death," she scolded, pushing him toward his room. "Get out of those wet things. I'll heat water for a bath." When he emerged later, warm and dry, she had soup waiting and the fire built up. Sarah was already asleep, worn out from helping with chores. They ate in companionable silence, but Eli noticed Miriam seemed nervous, fidgeting with her spoon. "What's troubling you?" he asked. She set down her bowl, took a breath. People came by today while you were out. Mrs. Morrison and 2 other women from town." Eli tensed. What did they want? To save my soul, apparently, and to warn me that living in sin would damn me forever. Her laugh was bitter, as if I wasn't already damned in their eyes. "What did you tell them?" "I told them to leave, but Eli..." She looked at him directly. "They threatened to bring the sheriff. Said what we're doing here isn't proper, isn't legal. Said they'd have me arrested for improper conduct." Rage flared through him. "Over my dead body. That's what I'm afraid of." She stood abruptly, pacing to the window. "This was a mistake. I've brought nothing but trouble to your door. Sarah and I should..." "Don't..." He was beside her in 2 strides, catching her shoulders, turning her to face him. "Don't even think about leaving." "But..." "No." His hands gentled on her shoulders. "Miriam, I need to tell you something. These past weeks, having you and Sarah here, it's shown me how empty my life was before. I built this ranch, made it successful, but it was just walls and land. You've made it a home." Tears gathered in her eyes. "Eli, I know we haven't spoken of it plain, but I think you feel it too. This thing between us." He cupped her face gently. "I'm not a man of pretty words, but I know what I want. I want you to stay. Not as my housekeeper or my charity case, but as..." "As what?" she whispered. "As mine," he said simply. "You and Sarah both, my family, if you'll have me." She made a soft sound, half sob, half laugh, and then she was in his arms, her face pressed against his chest. "Yes," she said, the word muffled but clear. "Yes, we'll have you." He held her tightly, feeling something settle into place in his chest. After a long moment, she pulled back slightly, looking up at him. The question in her eyes was clear. Slowly, giving her time to retreat, he lowered his head. Their first kiss was gentle, almost hesitant. Years of loneliness and pain making them cautious. But then her arms went around his neck, and his hands tangled in her hair, and gentleness gave way to need. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. Miriam's cheeks were flushed, her eyes bright. "The women from town were right about one thing," she said unsteadily. "This is improper." "Then we'll make it proper," Eli said firmly. "I'll get a ring tomorrow, find a preacher who'll marry us, make it legal and binding, so no one can say otherwise." She searched his face. "You'd marry me? Knowing what everyone believes about me?" "I'd marry you tomorrow if I could. Tonight, if there was a way." Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. "I don't deserve..." He silenced her with another kiss, shorter but no less meaningful. "You deserve everything," he said against her lips. "Everything I can give you and more." They stood there in the lamplight, holding each other, while outside the storm passed and stars began to appear. It wasn't the life either had planned. Wasn't the courtship Miriam had once dreamed of, or the solitary existence Eli had resigned himself to. But it was theirs, built from heartache and hope in equal measure. And that made it worth more than all the approval in the world. Winter arrived early that year, bringing with it the harshest cold anyone could remember. By December, snow had blocked the mountain passes and turned the desert into a white wasteland. The isolation that had once protected the ranch now became a trap, cutting them off from town and supplies. Eli had laid in provisions, but he hadn't counted on the storm that struck just before Christmas. It howled in from the north like a living thing, dumping snow in drifts that reached the windows, temperatures plunging so low that water froze in buckets inside the house. "We need to bring the horses into the barn," Eli said on the second day of the storm, peering out at the white fury beyond the windows. "They won't survive this in the open shelters. You can't go out in this," Miriam protested. They still hadn't found a preacher willing to marry them, but she wore the simple gold band Eli had bought, and in their hearts, they were already bound. "You'll get lost between here and the barn. I'll tie a rope to the porch, follow it back." He was already pulling on his heavy coat. "Those animals are our livelihood. Can't lose them." She knew better than to argue when his mind was set. Instead, she helped him bundle up, wrapping a scarf around his face until only his eyes showed. "Be careful," she whispered, rising on her toes to kiss his forehead. "Come back to us." The journey to the barn, normally a 2-minute walk, took 20 minutes of fighting through snow that reached his waist in places. The wind hit like fists, trying to knock him down, steal his breath. He could see nothing but white, hear nothing but the storm's roar. Only the rope in his hands kept him oriented. The horses were huddled together, ice forming on their manes and tails. Getting them to move was a battle. They were terrified, confused by the storm. One by one, he led them into the barn's relative warmth, his hands so cold he could barely feel the lead ropes. On the last trip, leading his prize stallion, the rope snapped. One moment it was taut in his left hand. The next it went slack, the frayed end whipping away in the wind. Eli froze, his heart hammering. Without the rope, in this whiteout, he might as well be blind. The house could be 20 feet away or a mile, and he'd never know. He tried to stay calm, to think. The wind was from the north, so if he kept it at his back, but the wind swirled and eddied, coming from all directions. He took a few steps in what he thought was the right direction, then stopped. This was how men died, wandering in circles until they froze. The stallion beside him snorted and pulled at the lead. Eli almost yanked him back, then paused. Horses had better instincts than men in weather like this. "All right, boy," he said, though his words were stolen by the wind. "Take us home." He gave the horse his head, following blindly, praying. Time lost meaning in the white world. His feet went numb, then his hands. Ice formed on his eyelashes, weighing them down. Just when he was sure they were lost, that he'd led them both to their deaths, the stallion stopped. A wall. Eli felt along it with clumsy hands until he found a door, not the house, but the chicken coop. From here, he knew the way. He put the stallion in the coop. No time to reach the barn again, and staggered toward where the house should be. He almost missed it. Would have walked right past if not for the lamplight Miriam had put in every window. He crashed through the door and collapsed on the floor, shaking so hard he couldn't speak. "Eli!" Miriam was there instantly, Sarah beside her. Together they pulled off his frozen clothes, wrapped him in blankets, dragged him to the fire. Miriam's hands were gentle but efficient as she checked for frostbite, rubbed feeling back into his fingers and toes. "Stupid," he managed through chattering teeth. "Rope broke. Almost didn't." "Shh." She held a cup of hot coffee to his lips. "You made it. That's all that matters." Sarah crawled into his lap, adding her small warmth to the blankets. "I was scared," she whispered. "Mama was crying." "I was not," Miriam said, but her red eyes betrayed her. They spent the rest of the day huddled by the fire, the three of them wrapped together in quilts while the storm raged outside. By evening, Eli had recovered enough to worry about practical matters. "We're low on firewood," he said, "and if this keeps up, we'll run short on food." "We'll manage," Miriam said firmly. "We have flour, beans, preserved vegetables. I can make it stretch." But as the storm continued into its third day, then fourth, their situation grew serious. The firewood dwindled despite their rationing. They moved into the kitchen, closing off the rest of the house to conserve heat. At night, they all slept near the stove, Eli and Miriam with Sarah between them. On the fifth night, Eli woke to find Miriam shivering despite the blankets. The fire had burned low, and the cold was creeping in like a living thing. He pulled her closer, wrapping his body around hers, trying to share what warmth he had. "We need more wood," she whispered, "but there's none left inside." He knew what that meant. The wood pile was outside, buried under snow, going out again, in the dark. "I'll go at first light," he said. "No." Her hand gripped his arm. "It's too dangerous. We'll burn furniture if we have to." And when that's gone, she was quiet, but he could feel her trembling. Not just from cold, he realized, but from fear. The same fear that gnawed at him, that they might not survive this. "Eli," she whispered, "if something happens, nothing's going to happen. But if it does, I need you to know." She turned in his arms, her face barely visible in the darkness. "These months with you have been the happiest of my life. You gave us hope when we had none. You gave us love when the world showed only hate. Whatever comes, I'm grateful." He kissed her then, pouring all his feelings into the touch: love, fear, determination. "We're going to make it," he said against her lips. "All three of us, I promise." In the morning, the storm had eased slightly. Eli could see perhaps 10 feet, an improvement over total whiteout. He made it to the woodpile and back 3 times before exhaustion forced him to stop. It would have to be enough. Sarah developed a cough that afternoon, the sound sharp in the cold air. Miriam tried to hide her panic, but Eli saw it in her eyes. They both remembered too well her bout with pneumonia. "Just a cold," Sarah insisted bravely. "I'm not really sick." They moved her bed directly next to the stove, piled every blanket they had on her small form. Miriam made tea from the herbs she'd dried last summer, spooned it into Sarah despite the child's protests that it tasted awful. That night, as Sarah's cough worsened, Eli made a decision. "I'm going for help at first light." "You can't. The snow—" "Fort Harrison is closer than town. If I can make it there—" "If," Miriam repeated. "If you make it, and if you don't, Sarah and I die here alone." The harsh truth hung between them. Together, they might survive until the storm broke. Divided, they were all at risk. "Then we wait," he said finally. Together. The storm broke on the 7th day. Eli woke to silence so complete it was almost frightening. He eased away from Miriam and Sarah, peered out the window. The sun was rising on a world transformed, everything buried under pristine white. But the sky was clear, brilliantly blue. "It's over," he breathed. They ventured out together, marveling at the snowdrifts that had reshaped the landscape. The barn was nearly buried, just the roof showing. Several of the smaller outbuildings had collapsed under the weight, but the house stood strong, and they were alive. It took 2 days to dig out enough to check on the animals. They'd lost some chickens, but the horses and cattle had survived. The stallion in the chicken coop whinnied when he saw Eli, as if to say, "I told you I'd get us home." A week later, when the roads were finally passable, John Hartley arrived from town with supplies. He looked surprised to find them well. "Folks in town figured you'd froze," he said bluntly. "Some were already talking about who'd get the ranch." "Sorry to disappoint them," Eli said dryly. Hartley grinned. "Not me. I had money on you making it." He handed over a package. "Doc Winters sent medicine for the little one. Said to use it if the cough persists. And there's mail, including something official-looking." The official letter was from a judge in the county seat. Miriam's hands shook as she read it aloud. Her former brother-in-law had filed a claim on her husband's land, the house they'd fled, without her there to contest it. The claim had been granted. "It's gone," she said numbly. "The last tie to my old life." Eli took the letter, fed it to the stove. "Good riddance. Your life is here now." That night, as they lay in their bed, for they no longer maintained the fiction of separate rooms, Miriam traced patterns on his chest. "During the storm, when I thought we might die, all I could think was that I'd never really told you." She paused, gathering courage. "I love you, Eli Rollins, not from gratitude or need, but truly, you're the best man I've ever known." He pulled her close, his throat tight. "And I love you, both of you, more than I knew a man could love." They held each other as moonlight streamed through the window, painting the snow-covered world silver. They'd survived the worst winter could throw at them. Whatever came next, they'd face it together. "Mama?" Sarah's voice came from the doorway. She stood there in her nightgown, no longer coughing. "Can I sleep with you? I had a dream about the storm." Without hesitation, they made room for her between them. As Sarah settled with a contented sigh, Eli looked over her head at Miriam. This was his family. Not bound by law yet, perhaps, but bound by something stronger. Love forged in hardship, tested by trials, and proven true. Outside, the winter night was cold and still. But inside, in a bed crowded with love and warmth, three souls who'd found each other against all odds slept peacefully. They'd earned this peace, this joy, with every frozen night and desperate day. And spring, when it came, would find them ready for whatever new challenges awaited, together. Spring arrived like a miracle after the harsh winter, painting the desert in shades of green and gold. The snow melted to reveal a world renewed, and with it came a renewal in the hearts of those who had survived its trials. Eli stood on the porch one April morning, watching Miriam and Sarah working in the garden. The seeds they'd planted the previous year had somehow survived, and now tender shoots pushed through the earth. Sarah's laughter rang across the yard as she chased a butterfly, her health fully restored, her spirit unbroken by all they'd endured. "John Hartley's coming," Miriam called, shading her eyes against the sun. A rider was indeed approaching, and Eli recognized the banker's son who'd helped him in that street fight months ago. "Eli, Mrs. Harper!" John dismounted with a grin. "Got news from town you'll want to hear." Miriam stiffened at being called by her old name, and John quickly corrected himself. "Sorry, ma'am, force of habit." Though maybe this news will fix that problem. "What news?" Eli asked. Though he kept his hand near his gun, good news was rare from Dry Creek. "There's a new preacher come to town, Reverend Michael Ashford, fresh from St. Louis, young fellow, not yet 30, and seems to have different ideas than the old guard." John's grin widened. "He's already ruffled feathers by preaching about compassion and forgiveness instead of fire and brimstone. When I mentioned your situation, he said he'd be honored to perform a wedding." Miriam's hand flew to her throat. "Truly?" "Truly, ma'am. Said he doesn't hold with judging folks based on gossip and that everyone deserves a chance at happiness." Eli felt something loosen in his chest. They'd been living as husband and wife in all but law, but the lack of official sanction had weighed on them both, especially Miriam. "When?" He said, "Whenever you're ready. Tomorrow, if you like." Eli looked at Miriam, saw the joy dawning in her eyes. "Tomorrow," he confirmed. "Tell him we'll be there." After John left with their answer, Miriam threw herself into Eli's arms. "We're really going to be married," she whispered. "Properly, legally married. Did you doubt it? I feared it might never happen, that we'd always live in the shadows." She pulled back to look at him. "But I have nothing to wear. My good dress was ruined in the storm." "Then we'll get you a new one." "Eli, we can't afford—" "Yes, we can." He smiled at her protests. "A man only gets married once. My bride will have a proper dress." The next morning dawned clear and perfect. They drove to town early, stopping first at the dressmaker's shop. Mrs. Chen, the Chinese seamstress who lived on the outskirts of town and was herself no stranger to prejudice, had worked through the night to alter a dress for Miriam. It was simple but elegant, pale blue silk that brought out her eyes. "You look beautiful, Mama," Sarah breathed, wearing her own new dress of yellow calico. "Like a princess." Eli agreed, his voice rough with emotion. The church was nearly empty when they arrived. Just John Hartley, Mrs. Chen, and surprisingly, Doc Winters. The doctor looked uncomfortable but determined. "Figured I owed you this much," he said gruffly to Eli, "for making me remember my oath to help folks, not judge them." Reverend Ashford was indeed young, with kind eyes and an easy smile. He greeted them warmly, showing no sign of the disapproval they'd grown accustomed to. "I've heard your story," he said quietly. "It seems to me you've already proven your commitment to each other through trials that would break most bonds. I'm merely making official what God has already joined." The ceremony was simple but perfect. When Ashford asked if anyone objected, Eli tensed, half expecting the doors to burst open with angry townspeople. But there was only peaceful silence. "Do you, Eli, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" To have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, as long as you both shall live. I do, Eli said firmly, his eyes never leaving Miriam's face. Do you, Miriam, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, as long as you both shall live? I do, she whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. Then by the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Mr. Rollins, you may kiss your bride. The kiss was sweet and profound, a promise sealed at last. Sarah clapped her hands in delight, and even Doc Winters smiled. As they signed the marriage certificate, making it legal and binding, Miriam's hand shook slightly. Miriam Rollins, she murmured, testing the name. It sounds right. They returned to the ranch as a truly married couple. The weight of uncertainty finally lifted. That evening, as they sat together watching the sunset, Sarah playing with her doll nearby, Miriam took Eli's hand. I have something to tell you, she said softly. I wasn't sure, but now, Eli, I'm going to have a baby. He stared at her, joy and terror warring in his chest. A baby? She nodded, suddenly uncertain. I know we haven't talked about children. If you're not happy, he silenced her with a kiss that left no doubt about his feelings. Happy doesn't begin to cover it, he said roughly. When? Late summer, I think August or September. Sarah, who had been listening, ran to them. A baby? I'm going to have a brother or sister? Yes, sweetheart, Miriam confirmed, pulling her close. How do you feel about that? Can I teach them things? Like Mr. Eli taught me about horses? Of course you can, Eli said, ruffling her hair. You'll be the best big sister in the territory. The months that followed were a time of quiet joy. Miriam bloomed with pregnancy, her face gaining a glow that made her more beautiful than ever. The ranch prospered as other ranchers, seeing the stand Eli had taken and respecting his courage, began doing business with him again. Even some townspeople, influenced by Reverend Ashford's sermons on forgiveness, began to thaw in their attitudes. The baby came on a blazing hot day in early September. Eli paced the porch while Mrs. Chen, who'd become a close friend, helped with the delivery. Sarah sat with him, holding his hand. Is Mama going to be all right? She asked. Your Mama's the strongest woman I know, Eli assured her, though his own heart was racing with fear. When the baby's cry finally rang out, both Eli and Sarah jumped up. Mrs. Chen appeared at the door, smiling. A son, Mr. Rollins, healthy and loud. Eli rushed inside to find Miriam holding a tiny bundle, her face exhausted but radiant. Come meet your son, she said. The baby was perfect, tiny fists waving, face red with indignation at being thrust into the world. When Miriam placed him in Eli's arms, something fundamental shifted in his universe. What shall we name him? Miriam asked. Eli thought of his brother, lost to violence, of new beginnings and second chances. Samuel, he said. Samuel James Rollins, after my brother, but his own man. Samuel, Sarah repeated, touching the baby's hand with one finger. Hello, Samuel. I'm your big sister. I'm going to take care of you. As autumn progressed, their life settled into new rhythms. Sarah proved to be a devoted sister, helping with the baby and telling him elaborate stories. Miriam juggled motherhood and ranch work with grace, and Eli found himself happier than he'd ever imagined possible. One evening in late October, as they sat on the porch, Eli with his guitar, Miriam nursing Samuel, Sarah playing with the new barn kittens, Tom Garrett rode up. Eli tensed, his hand moving to his gun, but Garrett raised both hands peacefully. Not here for trouble, Rollins, he said, dismounting slowly. Here to apologize. Eli said nothing, waiting. Garrett removed his hat, turning it in his hands. I was wrong. About about your wife, about you, that preacher, Ashford. He's been talking about how we've been acting ain't Christian, and seeing you all here, happy, family-like. He paused, struggling. My own wife left me last month. Said she couldn't stand my meanness anymore. Made me think about things. "What do you want, Garrett?" Eli asked, not unkindly but wary. "Just to say I'm sorry, and to tell you that if you need anything, help with Roundup, whatever, you can count on me." He looked at Miriam. "Ma'am, I said terrible things. I hope someday you can forgive me." Miriam studied him for a long moment, then nodded slightly. "Everyone deserves a second chance. Mr. Garrett, even you." After he left, they sat in thoughtful silence. Change came slowly to places like Dry Creek, but it did come. As winter approached again, they were ready. The woodpile was stocked high, the pantry full, the house tight against the wind. But more than physical preparations, they had the warmth of family to see them through. One night, as snow began to fall softly outside, Eli found himself standing in the doorway of the children's room. Sarah slept peacefully in her bed, one arm flung over her doll. Samuel slept in his cradle, making small baby sounds. Miriam appeared beside him, slipping her arm around his waist. "What are you thinking?" she whispered. "About how I came to town for barley," he said softly. "Just needed to feed my horses, and instead, you saved us, and we saved you right back." He turned to her, seeing in her face all the love and trust that had grown between them. "I've been thinking about what Sarah asked me once, whether I was a good man or a bad man. And what's your answer? I'm a man who tries, who fails sometimes, succeeds sometimes, but who knows one thing for certain." He drew her close. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in pristine white, but inside the Rollins house, warmth and love created their own climate, proof against any storm. They'd traveled a hard road to reach this moment, through prejudice and violence, storms and sickness, fear and uncertainty. But every trial had only forged their bonds stronger, until they stood unbreakable. A widow who'd been condemned by gossip, a cowboy who'd lived alone too long, a little girl who'd needed a father, and now a baby boy born into love. They were family, bound by choice and strengthened by adversity. And in the end, that was worth more than all the easy roads never taken. Thank you, dear listeners, for joining me on this journey through the American frontier, where love bloomed despite hardship and prejudice. I'm curious to know where in the world you're listening to this story. Please share in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to the From Wild West channel for more tales of courage, redemption, and romance from the Old West. What did you think of Eli and Miriam's story? Share your thoughts. I'd love to hear how their journey touched your heart. Until next time, partners, keep riding toward your own sunset.